I consider fasting not only a useful tool in health optimization and fat loss, but an irreplaceable practice for cellular cleanup. Remember, humans evolved through hundreds of thousands of years while practicing a range of involuntary fasting patterns, and clearly we evolved to be adapted to occasional periods of not eating, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. Let's talk about the fears and myths, misconceptions about fasting. One of the most popular misconceptions about fasting is that it's a starvation mode and so it cannot be good for you. Studies show that catabolic processes in the skeletal muscle tissue only start after 60 hours of non-eating. What about the metabolic rate slowing down? Because that's another myth. Does it go down? Well, studies show that metabolic rate does not decrease until 2-3 days after starting the fasting. So it may actually increase by up to 15% short term during fasting due to stress hormones. Another misconception is that skipping meals will lead to blood sugar getting dangerously low. But this evidence is not there. The evidence actually says that healthy adults can fast without real metabolic problems. Feelings of hunger are subjective and do not indicate actual hypoglycemia. And we will talk about who should abstain from fasting as well later on. And the last myth I want to touch upon at this time is that fasting can create unhealthy eating patterns and lead to eating disorders. A study on alternate day fasting showed minimal adverse outcomes, decreased depression and binge eating, while improving body image perception. So that's also a myth. Let's discuss the different types of fasting and the difference between fasting and actual starvation. It's important to note that why fasting has so many benefits is that it's ultimately about calorie restriction. And numerous studies on animals have shown that animals who eat less over their lifespan live longer. So let's have a look at what some of these fasting methods that have been widely researched that we can talk about. There are 3 that I'm going to bring up. Random meal skipping is one. This is just a natural way some people operate. They choose to skip a meal when they're busy, when there's no access to quality food, when there's traveling involved, etc. The second one is alternate day fasting. This is the most researched fasting method. People eat normally one day, and then they fast or consume less than 500 calories the next day, and they repeat the cycle. So it's important to note here that people eat normally. This is not like they go and, go to town and pig out. They eat still in calorie, not deficit, but they eat normally. So what would mean that they are maintaining their weight, eating for maintaining their weight. And then they slash their calories to either 0 to up to 500 the next day, which is kind of fasting or semi-fasting, I would say. The third one is time-restricted feeding. The difference here is that people do not have a complete day of fasting, but eat every day within a compressed eating window between 8 and 12 hours, which is very easy to do. There are obviously a wide array of possibilities with fasting. It doesn't have to be these 3 methods only. I actually love the 42 to 48 hours fast. I used to do it quite a lot when I was actively losing fat. And this is a fast where I only drank water, black coffee or tea, and didn't consume any food at all. I have to clarify because some people consider fasting when they're eating small amounts of food. I do not consider that fasting. And why it was my favorite is because at the 42-hour mark is where I started feeling the best, having acute mental clarity and the most energy. So what's the difference between fasting and starvation? Starvation is a long-term food restriction which leads to adverse health outcomes like loss of skeletal muscle, decreased metabolic rate, reproductive challenges, structural changes that can be irreversible. But in contrast, fasting is a time-limited food restriction alternating with refeeding or so-called feasting. Fasting is not detrimental to health and provides numerous benefits. And by the way, if you're concerned about regaining weight after caloric restriction, please note that short periods of fasting, as opposed to long-term starvation, are beneficial for fat loss and do not create conditions for weight regain. Now that we're talking about the benefits of fasting, let's go through them. So the benefits of fasting are fat loss, blood sugar control, autophagy, which is cleanup of damaged cell parts, improved lipid profile, improved cognition. Here are some controlled trials on intermittent fasting that have shown the following outcomes. 85% of intermittent fasting trials show statistically significant weight reductions. For example, a study on overweight women comparing daily energy restriction versus the 5-2 diet, which is 5 calories on 2 days per week. Both groups lost weight. Another one, fasting including the 5-2 diet, shows reductions in total cholesterol 10 to 21% and triglycerides 14 to 42% in normal weight, overweight, and obese people. Some studies show improvements in HDL cholesterol and triglycerides, but an increase in LDL cholesterol, which normally will go up when the person is using fat as fuel, because if you don't know, LDL is actually not the cholesterol itself, it's the bus on which the cholesterol sits. So if you're burning fat, you have more fat in your bloodstream. And if you're transporting fat to use it for fuel because you're actively losing weight, it's normal that the number of buses, these LDL particles in the bloodstream, will go up. So you just need to make sure that at the same time the inflammatory biomarkers are not elevated in your blood. Cholesterol by itself is not the concern in most cases. An important caveat here is that fasting for fat loss only works for daytime eating. Eating during sleep periods, for example, when it's dark outside, right, can lead to negative consequences. This is evidenced by higher rates of obesity, heart disease, and cancer in night shift workers. Taking care of your circadian biology is fundamental, always. The liver's functions, such as glycogen synthesis, which is converting carbohydrates into a storage form, which is done during the day, and then the opposite, glycogenolysis, breaking down of the glycogen to use for fuel, which happens at night, both are influenced by these rhythms. Let's talk about some of the mechanisms of fasting. First of all, it decreases chronic inflammation. Fasting is a powerful tool for slashing inflammatory biomarkers in the blood. A 2012 study during Ramadan showed a 57% decrease in IL-6 and a 71% decrease in TNF-alpha, which are inflammatory biomarkers in the blood. After 21 days of fasting, only 13 to 15 hours a day, that's nothing. Inflammation levels returned near baseline after resuming a normal diet, indicating the impact of fasting on inflammation. Another mechanism of fasting is improved stress response via heat shock proteins. Interestingly, fasting increases the production of heat shock proteins by the body, and they are essential for cell survival under stressful conditions and are highly conserved across the animal kingdom. So that's another benefit. And another mechanism, which is number 3, slows down the aging process. So fasting, how it does it is it reduces a growth factor called IGF-1. There's one study where 19 subjects fasted once a month for 3 months, and they resumed their normal diet. And these subjects displayed a 15% reduction in the level of IGF-1. This suggests that fasting increases IGF-1 sensitivity, indicating that the body is functioning on less growth signal which basically means it's an anti-aging process. And the fourth mechanism here is improvement in leptin sensitivity. So this is important for people who are both overweight and underweight. People who have trouble losing weight, they are leptin resistant, but also people who are underweight may be leptin resistant. Why is that? In simple terms, leptin resistance is the inability of the brain to receive the message on the energy balance of the body that this hormone leptin is supposed to transmit to the brain. And what has been shown that just a 24-hour fast, one 24-hour fast significantly improves the function of the leptin transporter at the blood-brain barrier. So it makes the brain more sensitive to leptin. Let's talk about negative effects of fasting. Are there negative effects? Well, of course, if you do fasting incorrectly, there will be negative consequences, right? So how not to do fasting? First of all, alternate day fasting study. Strict alternate day fasting for 3 weeks with 36-hour fast. So a person would eat for 12 hours, then not eat for 36 hours, then eat for 12 hours, and so on. For 3 weeks straight, resulted in weight loss from both fat and muscle mass. So this is undesirable. You want to lose weight in the form of fat and very minimal muscle mass, which you will probably lose a little bit anyway. Increased hunger throughout the trial. Improvements in insulin sensitivity were observed in men, but not in women. This is not fair, but maybe doing this for 3 weeks straight, 36-hour fasts every other day is just too much. There's a second study I want to show with negative effects, which was 1 meal per day. Subjects eating 1 meal per day for 2 months, dinner only. Okay, this is important. Had poorer blood glucose control compared to those consuming 3 meals per day. Interesting, huh? Again, this is too stressful if done for too long, not only because of 1 meal a day, but it's the timing of that meal. So if you eat later in the day, this may disrupt your circadian rhythm and you will pay the price. So strict patterns like 1 meal per day or prolonged fasting intervals may not be the ideal solution for long-term adherence. And who should avoid fasting? Well, generally people who are under high stress, like physical or psychological stress, hard training athletes, individuals with liver or other organ diseases, pregnant women, or those trying to conceive, poor sleepers, underweight individuals, children and the elderly, and people with eating disorders should not engage in fasting in general. Finally, it's important to note that most research in general is done on men and not so much on women, and this applies to fasting studies as well. But men generally will respond better to fasting than women, which makes total sense since women have this primary role of continuing the species, right, from the nature standpoint. But that doesn't mean that women should not fast at all. A sensible fasting protocol will depend on the individual circumstances. Are you trying to lose fat? You may want to do some extended fasting for some time, not too long. Women with severe insulin resistance that I've worked with may need to engage in up to 2 48 hours a week for a couple of weeks, with the caveat of eating enough on the day that they are eating. A good indicator of fasting too much, so if you're fasting too much, you can notice it because your sleep worsened. You might also notice that your hair starts falling out or you're feeling dizzy. Obviously, this will be a telltale sign that you're fasting too much. And remember that fasting does not need to be used constantly. Essentially, you will need to experiment and see what works for you in your situation. So let's talk about how to make fasting easier. Some tips here. So first of all, it's important to become fat adapted or keto adapted, but at least fat adapted. So you can stick to a ketogenic diet or a paleo style diet for several weeks before you start engaging in fasting, because this will lower your blood sugar and stop this roller coaster of blood sugar that happens when you eat modern diet. So before you can start fasting naturally and effortlessly, try just to skip one meal and preferably dinner for reasons discussed above. And then after a while, start experimenting with longer fasts, shortening your eating window gradually as you see fit. And another tip is, when you do eat, choose nutrient-dense whole foods as opposed to junk food, processed foods, especially avoiding refined carbs. Such foods hijack our brains and make it much more difficult to fast. During the fast, drink calorically less coffee, tea, herbal infusions, and take plenty of salt. Come up with a plan of how you can stay away from the kitchen if you're doing a longer fast. Make plans to keep busy. And do not skip your exercise while fasting. Very important to continue exercising even when you're fast. In conclusion, as you can see, there's no black and white answer when it comes to the ideal fasting protocol. What I have found works best from the fasting and circadian standpoint as well is to transition generally to 2 meals a day, breakfast and lunch, for most days, with an occasional light dinner when you want to be social. And on top of that, adding an extended fast once in a while. Like if you're generally healthy, maybe a 24-hour fast a couple of times a month. If you want to, bring your hormones into more like a sensitive place. If you have a lot of excess body fat, maybe build up to 2 fasts of 36 to 48 hours a week, but only do it for 2-3 weeks, then take a break. And if you only have a little bit of excess fat, maybe just 1 meal a day a few times a week, but not every day for weeks on end, will do the trick. It's easy nowadays to measure health parameters and get data on yourself. And this is very cool, very empowering. So if you've been on the fence in regards to fasting, I would encourage you to give it a try. See for yourself what comes out of it. Get a continuous blood glucose monitor and see how your blood sugar reacts to your eating and fasting patterns. There's a lot to be learned there besides fasting. Additional tools are the Whoop strap or the Oura ring. You can see your sleep and HRV change with your lifestyle and dietary changes. If you're trying to achieve ketosis, the Keto Mojo blood meter is great for tracking both blood glucose and ketones. And of course, you can run blood labs before and after a couple of months of fasting and check the difference in the biomarkers.